This presentation is the third in a series of 3 presentations. It's about the Colonel Richard Summers' 3rd Gloucester Battalion's part in the battle at Chestnut Neck in Port Republic, New Jersey today, which took place on October 6, 1778. Now, this is a map of New Jersey, an old map, and it shows the line going directly up from here between West Jersey and East Jersey. And the 2 areas that I want to familiarize you with are the Little Egg Harbor Inlet, that area, which is called the Mullica River today, specifically the narrow point in the river called Chestnut Neck, and then at the which this is at the northern end of Atlantic County, and then I also want to point out that at the southern end of Atlantic County is another river called the Great Egg Harbor River that flows by Summers Point. But in the time of the American Revolution, they were known as the Great Egg Harbor River and the Little Egg Harbor River. The word Mullica was not used at that point. On the next slide, someone asked me when we began this presentation, how did we get the area, the name Chestnut Neck? Well, that was a good question, but it was a little more difficult to answer. In 1678, a man named William Clark settled on the Mullica River, the Little Egg Harbor River, right across from Lower Bank, and began a development called Clarktown. By the way, Clarktown had as many as 400 people in it at one time, maybe more. They were doing legal shipping out of there to New York City, and they began already in the 1680s to do privateer smuggling immediately. Molasses, sugar, rum, lumber, and food. Notice I've underlined molasses, sugar, and rum. Yeah. These Presbyterians and these Quakers were partying Presbyterians and quivering Quakers. For those of you who offend easily, I put a little smiley face there so you know I'm only playing. Now in 1690, other families settled the county. The Summers did, and other families came in at that time, and the industries were farming, cedar, lumbering. Privateering was big right from the beginning, and privateering at that point meant smuggling, and of course fishing was good. Now, as we go further, I have given this map. You're going to find this on the next 4 slides, and the arrows will not change. I just want to point out places for you so I can orient you. We're still on the question of how did we get the name Chestnut Neck. Here we have Lower Bank up here where the Clarks settled. That, by the way, is a bridge today going across the river. Clarktown was right down from that, probably right outside of Hog Island, John, where you and I went out in the marshes to see those graves. Now, somebody from the Clark family, which I'm going to tell you later, moved down a little closer to Port Republic and started a place called Clark's Mills, and it was also known as Brotherton sometime. I could not find out what the Brotherton name meant, but it was at some time in the 1700s known as that. It was also down here at Port Republic, began by being known as Hewitttown, then it became known as Wrangleboro, and it only became known as Port Republic in almost the middle 1800s. Over here we have Chestnut Neck, and Chestnut Neck is the neck where the river is the narrowest, and on both sides at this time they were loaded with chestnut trees, hence the name Chestnut Neck. But there was one other place of interest that I want to show you, and that's Gravelly Landing, which Don Higby and I were trying to think out where it would be. It's on a hill right next to the Nakoti Creek, that's all I can tell you, and it also became known as Brimstone Hill right after the Battle of Chestnut Neck, and you'll see why. So let me continue with my history now with this map in front of you. In 1710, the Swedes came in and they settled Hewitttown, and this name gave way, and the larger area became known as Wrangleboro. And all the books on New Jersey say the same thing, that basically Wrangleboro was because they were wrangly people, they were feisty people around their taverns there, and probably that came because the main smuggled commodity was rum.
I didn't ask for a beverage. Could I get a cup of coffee?
In 1731, Shore Road is built, and it goes all the way up to Nakoti Creek. But Jim Mason, our county traffic engineer, has verified that there was no ferry across this Nicody Creek until after 1810. So we need to know that. Yeah, if I can have the next slide up. Now, the Molasses Act came in 1733, and instead of preventing smuggling like the British had hoped, you know what it did. If you know history, it actually increased smuggling at places like Tom's River, Little Egg Harbor, Cape May, and Cohansey. And then in 1762, now here's where we get Clark's Mills. People from Clark's town moved to Clark's Mills, settling at present Port Republic. And Chestnut Neck was very, very lightly populated. It had one function and one function only early, and that was to be a port, a storage point for the bigger ships to come in, reload, and get stuff up to the forks. And that's all it was used for at that particular point. If I can have the next slide. 1764, the British, according to their pattern, whatever didn't work, they tried to do more of that. And so they enacted the Sugar Act. It backfired again, and smuggling went up. And the more smuggling went up, the more rum went up the Little Egg Harbor River. The north side of the creek, at this point at Port Republic, becomes known as Wrangleboro Mills and Blackman Mills, and on the south side is just known as Wrangleboro and Gravelly Landing. That gives you an idea. And I believe this next slide is the last about Port Republic. Finally, in 1774, Galloway Township is formed, and Wrangleboro, Chestnut Neck are simply parts of Galloway Township. When we finally get to the battle in 1778, most of the buildings at Chestnut Neck were burned. Only 3 were rebuilt for privateering activity. The story that was completely rebuilt simply is not true. Other folks, all the rest of the people that lived there, moved up the Nicody Creek to Gravelly Landing, faced a tough, cold winter where a lot of them almost died, and they nicknamed Gravelly Landing Brimstone Hill because they saw that as kind of like being in hell for that winter. 1779, most of the Chestnut Neck area folks now moved to Wrangleboro, what we know as Port Republic today, on both sides of the creek. That's why today you see houses on both sides of the creek. And Chestnut Neck simply takes the name of the chestnut trees that surrounded it, were the sign to the people of where the unloading part of the river was. And that is the rest of the story about Chestnut Neck. And we will now go on to the story of what happens afterwards. In the 1820s, Clark's Mills is destroyed by a windstorm, kind of like what we almost got a week or so ago, and it just knocked it down. All those families moved to Wrangleboro. Finally, in 1840, they decided they were tired of all these little communities. They decided to call it Unionville, and they sent the name into the post office, and the post office said, no way, we have too many Unionvilles already. They had a township meeting, an area meeting, and they decided on Port Republic because of the battle there, and that was approved by the post office. In 1905, Port Republic became a city, and it is now a separate city, separate from Galloway Township. And that's the rest of the story. If you give me the next slide. Now let's talk about the battle that occurred at Chestnut Neck, now that you know where Chestnut Neck is. This, by the way, is 1/4 of the painting that is on the wall of the restaurant in Smithville that we are attempting and to eventually have removed. This is the part where the ships are firing. Incidentally, as we looked at this painting against the records, the painting is, there's a little artistic flair in it. They certainly didn't get these size ships up through Great Bay, okay? But it looks good, okay? And of course there were no Indians running around at the time. New Jersey had long since blocked them off and they were away. If I can have the next slide, please. Here is the river, the way you see it today. This is the river coming around. Back up where my hand is would be the actual mouth of the river in Great Bay. Here is where Nicody Creek comes in. The parkway would be going across here today, right in from here over to here. And when you come around, here's where the mud fort is. Here's where the road is today, and here's this little road that went to the mud fort. Now these roads are all from a later artist rendering. They exist now. It's doubtful they existed. Probably the only road that existed then was this road going up to Port Republic, and maybe this was a horse path for a ferry being here. But this neck is what's called Chestnut Neck, and if you've ever seen the larger print of this, it tells you who all these houses belong to at that particular time. Now I do want you to focus on one thing before we get into the battle. You see where this little mud fort is? By the way, right here along this road is where the monument is.
That Marilyn Goos is
Hello? It probably is Maryland.
We're in the middle of the presentation here.
And I'm Marilyn.
I texted Marilyn to let her know that Fran had to go to urgent
All
care.
over home.
So that's why she called here. Should never give her a phone number and tell her one of her girlfriends is not feeling well. She can't be beside herself. Anyway, you see this fort that's right here? One of the things we learned from the pension applications and from the British records themselves is there was a second gun emplacement which Jim Mason has been able to tell us was probably right over here, in this area here. We can't tell because it's all been cut apart for roads now today, but there was a second gun emplacement where there were supposed to be guns, enough that the British thought there were cannon there when they came in. And if we could go to the next one. I could not find a picture of a mud fort, girl. I want to tell you that. The closest I could get is this kind of thing, which was built on a beach. But the idea was it was a wall of mud with sticks in it. How many of you remember the battle, the siege of Boston, where finally the British sail out of the harbor? If you remember the reason for them sailing out and then wanting to get out of Dodge, was that all the cannon from Ticonderoga were brought down to Boston, and the Patriots were able to get them on top of Dorchester Hill and to look down. And what they did is they built mud embankments. Now with sticks in them, and the idea was that when they used sticks that were not dead and dry and were still springy, that these mud walls could handle a lot of bombarding. If you've ever gone to Fort Mifflin outside the Philadelphia airport, that fort was bombarded for several weeks before it finally was just turned into a pile of dirt. But it took a tremendous bombardment. The cannon that were assigned here never reached them. They did not have them. And I said right here that on December 1673, to bring people up to date, was the Tea Party. And here's the point I say that for. On August 19, 1775, you have the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Now, we think of that today as, boy, a few months after that, everything started. Let me tell you something. By the time the Battle of Lexington and Concord happened, as the minute the news got down here, what was called the Egg Harbor Guard was formed by Richard Somers immediately. And they were already guarding the forks and the beaches already by the summer of 1775. So we were in action in this area long before there was a war. John, if I can have the next slide. In 1775, of course, the Second Continental Congress meets. Washington is made commander. Britain declares war, and we have the battles at Breed's and Bunker's Hill, the bigger one being at Breed's Hill. In October 75, while this is going on, the 3rd Battalion is already at work, and they have captured their first prize, called the Rebecca and Francis, right on the Brigantine Beach. We're told of that by Privates David Summers and Albert Albertson. They were part of the company that was on duty that caught this ship when it got grounded and took all the cannon, all the supplies. And they even, in both of their pensions, have a matching list of what they took off the ship. And it's fascinating to read that. Yeah, this is the kind of size ship our privateers were. They weren't big men. We didn't build those. We had these type of schooners. If I can have the next one, John. Now, the
Norm, was that a warship or a commercial ship?
well, what they were, if you go the up arrow, these were initially commercial ships. They were shore runners going from port to port, and they were also used to run down to the Caribbean to bring back sugar, molasses, and rum. What they did is they converted them by putting cannon on them, but the advantage that they had is they were small, they were fast, and when you brought them into places like Longport or Holgate at the time, into Great Egg Harbor Bay, they could get over the sandbars when the tide was up.
The type is called a topsail schooner.
Pardon me?
The type of ship is called a topsail schooner.
A topsail schooner, and I assume that's because they have a topsail.
Yes.
Okay. If I can have the next slide. Yeah. Now let's talk about the mud fort, because we're going to put this all together. In April 1776, this is before the Declaration of Independence, and they are already building this mud fort at Chestnut Neck. Private Isaac Hicksman tells us that it was started in April, it was continued to be worked on in May of June, and that they also called it Fort Tucker. We don't know why. Maybe someone from Tuckerton, the Tucker family, provided part of the money. Other than that, we don't know. Remember, Chestnut Neck and Tuckerton are one unit of families intermarrying, getting along, helping each other, related. It's one community. In July of 1776, the first firefight occurs in the area. Now, this is something that's going to be new to all of you other than Earl. Private Zadok Bowen, there's the Bowen name, John, tells us that some of the British cruisers, they called them, look at the spelling, came in and drove us off. He's talking about the fort. Before the fort was completed and we had any guns, we were ordered back to the same place. So the Battle of Chestnut Neck is only the culmination of many British attempts to go up the river and stop the smuggling and stop the privateering. John? Excuse me, go the up arrow once more, John. This is another piece of the Chestnut Neck battle, and this shows the men firing from the high ground. Now, there's nothing in the pension applications to say they did that, but in the British records, it talks about a second gun emplacement on high ground. So this is probably where this came from. This is another quarter of that picture in the restaurant in Smithville, and the only thing we've done here is we've lightened them up in Photoshop a little bit. John, if I can have the next one. Now again, going back to privateering, I found this picture of a larger ship. I don't know that these are scale, but it seems to be, as I read these pension applications and I read about privateering, what you're talking about is smaller ships that are fast going out and capturing bigger ships. You say, how did they do that? Because the bigger ships are not men of war. They're supply transport ships. So maybe they had a 3-pounder cannon on the front and the back, and that was about it. And they would come up with them, and maybe they'd be 8 guns or 6 guns on each side, and a couple more cannon, and a bunch of guys hanging in the rigging, looking like pirates, I guess, with knives and the thing. And they basically would chase them down, and when you're out there alone with sails, and you got an armed ship coming up, and you have no soldiers, you have no choice but to surrender, do you? And that's how we got our thing.
So, do you know who those 2 ships are? No,
One's the
No, but I don't.
that's the Coast Guard brig Eagle,
Okay.
formerly the Horse Basel,
Okay.
and the forefront is the Black Pearl, commanded by Captain Horatio Sinbad out of the Beaufort, North Carolina.
How about that?
Very
Who's the
good.
guy on the left?
Hanging over for it.
This guy here? His name's Joe.
Probably Mr. Brown.
His
Yeah.
name is Field.
In August, same year. Now listen, in August, as they're building the fort, fort men are ordered to run up to Absecon, run up Shore Road, and they captured 16 Tories that had come in to burn buildings where you live there, John, and steal cattle. Private Isaac Hickman tells us that. In the next month, September, the 3rd Battalion captures 3 more cargo ships, Private Levi Priest tells us. That Price tells us. Now, here's the issue. Remember this, what's going to cause the Battle of Chestnut Neck is right there. snatching, going offshore, snatching ships, bringing them up here, unloading them, shipping up to the forts, or bringing them into Summers Point. By the way, they brought them in there, and they's landing, selling the stuff off, and this goes to help the war effort.
What happened to the crew of these ships?
The crew would go in to become prisoners, and they would be exchanged with the British for Americans that were captured. And by the way, the insurance rates between 1776 and the time of the Battle of Chestnut Neck in Britain for shipping had more than doubled because of the privateering. So the raid was really an economic idea that came from Great Britain itself. It didn't originate in Hal's brain. It was pushed on him by the Admiralty because they had people screaming over there, they're losing their shirt. If I can have the next slide. In 1777 of June, before Chestnut Neck again, more than a year, Sumner's men were marched to Leeds Point in order to attack 3 of the enemy ships that had come into Great Bay now and are laying in the bay. We succeeded in setting one of the ships on fire and she sank, John Ingersoll says. And he even goes on to say that in 1832 you can go out and see the hulk of that ship still there today. I went all around with a fish finder and can't find any hulk at all. So it's probably long been eaten by mud bugs. In March 1778, still 6 months before the battle, the Summers men were marched to Clamtown, that's Tuckerton. It was a place infested by Tories. And by the way, we do know now there was at least one family in Atlantic County that were loyalist Tories, and their land was sold, and they were the English family, half of the English family, from which we get English Creek today. Private James Steelman and David Summers tell us that, and you all know that a Steelman would always tell the truth. Now, by the way, I chose this picture carefully. Here are the Tories with their hat out collecting money for people. The Tories really were out to abuse the people that were not committed either way. And so that's partially what shifted a whole lot of Quakers over, in this area at least, to fight. John, we can go to the next one.
So these Tories lived in that area, or did they come from Tom's River?
No, they were from Tuckerton all the way up, all of what we call Ocean County today, and part of the southern part of Monmouth County, which literally we could have called it Toryville. Now, we had many times, that's not part of this presentation, they came in and burnt people's houses, killed people in Atlanta, what we call Atlantic County. But also in the Monmouth County records and in the Middlesex County records, we have a record of the Tories going up that way and doing the same thing. So they had their hands full with them too. So we're not talking about 10 or 20 or 30 people. We're probably talking about a few hundred. And in June of 1778, we had a long...
This is the first American
Why do they call these guys privates?
What's the year?
Zephaniah was a major, wasn't he?
Captain.
Okay, there were 2 Zephaniahs. There were 2 Zephaniah Steelmans. One was an officer, and the other was a private. They were probably uncle and nephew. Now, after a long chase, they chased some refugees. This is in Atlantic County, this happened. And they grabbed 20 or 30 prisoners and their captains, Turner and Howlings. These guys even knew the name of the captains they caught. Yeah, before the battle in 1778, the British had been to that place, Chestnut Neck, James Giberson says, 3 times and burned the vessels or took typographical them off. So Chestnut Neck, the Battle of Chestnut Neck, is the 4th and culminating battle of an ongoing set of raids the British had to try to stop this tremendous privateering effort in our county by our people. It is well known that the Chestnut Neck was the most active privateering place south of Boston and north of Charleston. And that's where, now why would that be? Because they could bring it in here and transship it to the largest city in the colonies at that time, Philadelphia. So it's really about dollars. Next, John. Here we again go back to this map because now we're talking about the battle proper. Remember, there's no cuts here that they're coming through according to the old maps. So they're having to come in at Holgate, a little, maybe a few miles north of the tip of Long Beach Island where the Coast Guard factory station would be today. They're having to come into Little Egg Harbor Bay, down into Great Egg Harbor Bay. We don't know whether they called them two names by then. It may have all been just called Little Egg Harbor Bay, and take this whole windy river in a sailing ship that every time they go round the turn, they've got a different wind and a different tide. The British were told by loyalists that there were men already at Chestnut Neck and that they had cannon. But the British didn't know there were no cannons there. The Loyalists didn't know. They just knew there were forts there. John, the next one. Why did Chestnut Neck happen? There were really a final 18 straws for General Clinton that brought about Chestnut Neck. Well, the first 10 of the 18 straws were 10 ships captured and sold at the house of Richard Westcott, Esquire, at the Forks in Egg Harbor on Tuesday, the 28th of July, 1778. What vessels were they? The Industry, the Dispatch, Molly's Adventure, Canister, Carolina Packet, Prince Frederick, Speedwell, Jenny, and Bachelor. Well, not too much later, 4 more ships, 4 more straws were captured and sold on Tuesday, September 8th, right at Chestnut Neck. The Rising Sun, the Governor Henry, the Nancy, and the William. And then finally on September 14th, Monday, in May's Landing, the cargo ships Venus and the schooners Fame, Hannah, and Defiance were the last 4 straws. And this one here was the big one. This was a big cargo ship. And at that point, the British were pulling their hair out. John, what happened? From England comes the order from Lord Germain himself, the Secretary of State for the Colonies. Embark a body of troops to attack the ports and destroy all ships. He's talking about all privateers and other property along shore, so as to incapacitate the rebels from continuing their depredations. So what does Howe do? Next slide, please. He says, I propose, this is in his records, taking forward a position with the army to favor an expedition to Egg Harbor. Now what does he mean by that? He means he's going to send Cornwallis into North Jersey to set up a ruse. So Washington will stay up there because he doesn't want Washington to be able to get his troops to go to Chestnut Neck and destroy the action. He said, at which place, Egg Harbor, remember that's Chestnut Neck, the enemy had a number of privateers and prizes and considerable salt works. Accordingly, I requested Lord Cornwallis to take a position in Jersey. So Cornwallis goes out and takes several thousand troops into North Jersey and sets up a bit of confusion. Now, how serious is he? Well, for a little village with a dozen house buildings in it, he sends 13 ships, almost 1,700 men, and sends about 3,000 more troops under Cornwallis to act as a distraction up north. Chestnut Neck is not a ho-hum little deal to the British. It's big money, John. These privateers, these swamp men, are just tearing the British up. John? Now the battle itself, what happens? On October 5th, the British arrive in Little Egg Harbor Bay. Loyalists from Tuckerton, etc., warn the British that the 3rd Battalion's at the fort and that they have cannon emplacements. The British row troops 20 miles up the river. Now I put 20 miles here because that's what they said. Maybe it's 20 miles. I can't figure how it is with all, even from Holgate. I mean, I don't think it can be. But that's what it says, so that's what we'll go by. Now they bring them up in smaller boats with the cannons. It's not the big ships that are coming in. It's the smaller stuff that can get over the sandbars. On October 6th at 4 p.m. the British are coming up to here. They turn here, they see the 2 forts, that's in the British records, and they attack with their cannon first. They start firing. Now here's a place where this map is going to be wrong. It's going to show they come here. However, the British records show that they went north of the fort and landed the men on the other side of the fort, where the Parkway Bridge is today. Now, on October at 4:30 p.m., the British have landed and they have taken the village. There is no fight, other than maybe some sniping fight. By 5 p.m., the militia has withdrawn, but they wounded one British soldier. That's in the British records of the battle. One guy was shot in the leg. And by 6 p.m., the ships and the village are being burned. So the British come in. Here's Fort 1. Here's another gun emplacement here. Colonel Summers' people back up to Port Republic. Right up there. Don, what's that road going back from Chestnut Neck right into port?
Chestnut Neck Road.
Chestnut,
Old New York Road.
Old New York Road. Chestnut Neck Road. That's where they go. Okay, next slide, please. Now here are the other last two parts of that picture. The British are coming ashore. This is a little artist license on here. They didn't come in on the docks. They came in north onto the marsh and swept into town. And here, of course, they're burning the village, and I guess that's as good as what a burnt village looks like. If we can have the next slide. So we come back to our map. What do? Well, the militia moves from Wrangleboro back up to port, which is not port yet, just some mills up there, and they move back down Old New York Road to the area that we call Leeds or Leeds Point. There's no great line between what was Leeds and what was Leeds Point. It was kind of Leeds, and Leeds Point was out where Ocean, where the restaurant is.
At the time, the whole area, Smithville and Leeds Point, was all Leeds.
That's correct.
And it was later that they kind of...
But in this, they specified that they went to the point, and there were 400 militia there. Now, the British, while they're back there the next day, they send troops up on the other side of the river into Ocean County, southern Ocean County, and they destroy 3 salt works, which are very important, and several Patriot homes. The British received the word that Proctor is coming with his cannon and his men from Haddonfield, and that Pulaski is coming from North Jersey, and they pull back into Egg Harbor Bay. Now, I'm not going to tell you the story of the Osborne Island issue, because that's not part of this. The militia reoccupied the neck and remained there till the British leave the whole bay 3 weeks later. But here's something I didn't know. This was in the British records. A few militia on patrol from Atlantic County were taken prisoner and sent to New York, and that explains why one guy is in a New York prison ship right after Chestnut Neck, which I never could figure out why. The fort is rebuilt, and it is occupied and cannon-filled, by the way, for the rest of the war. And by the way, I don't know whether I have it on the next slide, once they did this, the troops all went down to Summers Point, and guess what Colonel Proctor had them do there? Build another mud fort, right where the 1812 War of 1812 fort sign is, and they cannoned that, and they were throwing balls over the beach in Ocean City for practice. So they had some decent-sized cannon in there at that particular point. John? And here are the people that we know were at Chestnut Neck. Of course, Colonel Summers, Colonel Robert Taylor, who's from the Haddonfield area. Here are the captains, Conover, Payne, Higby, Steelman. Here's your other Steelman at this point. He's still a captain at this point. William Price, Joseph Estelle, Samuel Snell. Here are 2 lieutenants, Jeremiah Lee, Simon Lucas. Here are the privates, and this is one of the privates that was captured as a POW and went to New York for 7 months to spend in the ship. Now, the battalion contained about 250 men, but while this is going on at Chestnut Neck, other companies were at the fort standing guard, they were guarding Summers Point, and very possibly had some people up at Haddonfield as well, because remember, by this point, we have the British all around. And everything here is from the State Archives. Next slide, John. This slide presentation, because we use the book by Franklin Kemp to such a great extent, we've chosen to give wherever we give it, in honor of Franklin. By the way, if you've never seen our letterhead, Franklin is the Secretary Emeritus of our chapter, and we even list the name of his book in case people want to buy it. Last slide, John. This presentation is a work in progress. If you asked me what this presentation was going to look like 6 months ago, it was about half as large. But in the research, we just kept finding more and more and more information. And I really believe, I don't know where, that we will still find more information. And so wherever I go to give this presentation, I am asking people to do this. If you have any additional information about the activities of Colonel Richard Summers, 3rd Gloucester Militia Battalion, please contact me and share it. And so, the presentation is respectfully submitted.